Let me give you the big idea of where we're going so you can see it right off the bat in case you have to check out middle of the way through the message. And then we're going to see it in Joseph's life and in our life as well. Here's the big idea of where we're going today. The greatest threat to a dream you can't see yet might be decisions nobody else will see now. The greatest threat to your dream, to my dream, even if we can't see it yet, may be decisions that nobody else will see right now. Just like with buildings, bridges, and aircrafts, the best time to diagnose a fracture, a crack, or a weakness in your structural integrity was yesterday. The second best time to diagnose it and to reinforce it is right now. If you got a Bible, would you grab it and meet me in Genesis 39 today? Genesis 39 is where we're going to be for week 2 of a series that we've called In Your Dreams. And we're traveling through the story of a character from the Jewish scriptures named Joseph. And we're going to be in Genesis 39 today. If you were here last week, you know as we launched into this series, we sort of did a 30,000-foot flyover in the story of Joseph and tugged on the string of dreams just a little bit because it gets woven all the way through his story. If you weren't here last week, you can catch that online. If you want to catch up, you're not too far behind, or podcast if you want to do that. But there are 2 really important things that we said as a part of this series and as a part of this story that I don't want you to miss if you missed last week. And the first one is this. If you go back all the way in the story of God and the story of humanity, the very, very beginning, God's people have always been dreamers, always. When we say dreams, we don't just necessarily mean the kind of in your dreams that some of us have. You know, like I dream of 6-pack abs. I've got a 1-pack on a good day in the morning if I hold things just right in the mirror before I've eaten anything, you know, but I dream of 6-pack abs. Dream of a 6-figure salary. Dream of someone who thinks like me, who decides like me, who's calling all the shots in Washington from here on out. Okay, we're not just talking about those kind of dreams when we say dreams. We're not necessarily not talking about those kind of dreams. We'll get to that in just a second. But when we say dreams, here's the idea. Here's what we mean by dreams. A dream, the way we're defining it, is a vision or a sense of what God wants to do with you. Or maybe for you, or perhaps through you. We're talking about a reason, maybe even in your mind, the reason that he put you on the planet. And I wonder if you have something like that. Actually, I believe you do have something like that. I just wonder if you know what it is. Even if you don't see it completely, even if it's not fully formed, even if it feels shallow or superficial or selfish, even if you're not even sure it's from God. I mean, the truth is, some of us, when it comes to our dreams right now, we dream of being rich and powerful and adored. Like we dream of being the boss and everyone in our world bowing down to us. Now, hearing somebody say that out loud, there's something in us that kind of instinctively goes, I don't know, like we would say out loud, no, I don't think that's my dream. Internally, we know that's kind of it. And if that's you and that's where you feel and that's what you think when it comes to your dream, don't forget, that's how Joseph's story starts. And yet, over time, when it comes to our dreams, in the hands of the dream giver, in the story of Joseph, what we've seen is we can expect even those dreams to be transformed along the way, to the point that we find ourselves later on in our story with something that's different, it's harder, it takes longer, but is better when it comes to our dreams. At some point, the dream begins to transform from something that's a little like an acorn into something that's stronger and sturdier along the way. And that matters because some of us are there. Some of us have a dream that we realize, I can't miss that. I can't miss out on that. Maybe in the area of legacy, maybe in the area of a difference that you believe God's called you to make in the world, or even in your family or the lives of your children or your grandchildren, you begin to realize this is too big for me to not pay attention to it. Whatever it is, something tells us that we don't want to live our lives for anything less than that dream's best. And here's why that matters so much, because when we find ourselves living in our dreams and they're different and they're harder and take longer and are better, we can expect them to be tested all along the way. And when it comes to the dream, the best of our dreams, some of us already know, and all of us have to realize, we can't afford to flunk the tests. And that brings us to Genesis 39 today. We turn our attention to Genesis 39 today. We're going to talk about what might be the most important test of them all. I'm going to call it the integrity test. So when Carrie and I first got married, we bought a fixer-upper house and decided to remodel it together. So that turned out to be a good financial decision for us, and it might be for you. It often turns into a good financial decision to do something like that, but I do feel like I ought to warn you, if that's in your dreams or in your plans to buy and remodel a house, most of the financial investment or the profit that you make off an investment like that, you're likely going to reinvest in marriage counseling on the other side. Especially if you're like my wife and, you have an eye for a design and you marry somebody who doesn't. And not only doesn't have an eye for design, was not born with instincts towards construction or structural engineering. So it turns out there are these things called load-bearing walls. Who knew? And despite how it looks on TV when Chip Gaines does it, you need to know that demo day doesn't always have a happy ending. But just in case when it comes to your dreams, you don't have a friend like I had who explained it to me right before I started swinging the sledgehammer at a load-bearing wall, I want to be that friend to you. There's this structural engineering concept called structural integrity that you probably ought to know about. Here's what structural integrity is. Structural integrity is the ability of a structure to perform its designed function, what it was made to do, and to withstand its intended load, whether it's force or weight or pressure, whatever it was intended to carry, without failing due to fracture, deformation, warping, bending, or fatigue. Okay, so this is true of things like buildings, big or small, houses to skyscrapers. It's true of bridges. It's also true of aircraft, from the little single-engine planes that you see kind of bebopping around the Metroplex, all the way to the F-35s that go zooming over the sky during the day, to the space shuttle as well. Structural integrity matters. There are elements within those buildings and bridges and aircraft that hold them up and hold them together so that they can do what they were designed to do. They can hold the weight that they were intended to carry, and even extra pressure that's put on them by weight or force along the way, without warping or breaking or wearing out. Here's why that matters. You may know this if you're an engineer, you've ever studied this kind of thing. If one of those elements, structural integrity elements, fails, it doesn't just affect the element. If the weight is too much on a load-bearing wall, the weight gets transferred to another element. And if it can't stand it, then it transfers it to something else, and you can find yourself with a catastrophic failure of integrity that doesn't just affect the element, affects the whole building. And not just the building, all of the things that are near it, and the people that are near it too. It's true of buildings. It's true of bridges and aircraft and dreams. Let me give you the big idea of where we're going so you can see it right off the bat in case you have to check out middle of the way through the message. And then we're going to see it in Joseph's life and in our life as well. Here's the big idea of where we're going today. The greatest threat to a dream you can't see yet might be decisions nobody else will see now. The greatest threat to your dream, to my dream, even if we can't see it yet, may be decisions that nobody else will see right now. Just like with buildings, bridges, and aircrafts, the best time to diagnose a fracture, a crack, or a weakness in your structural integrity was yesterday. The second best time to diagnose it and to reinforce it is right now. So that's what we want to do today. We want to spot some areas of vulnerability in our story while observing what held Joseph's dreams together, despite immense pressure, prolonged pressure that would have been easy for him to fracture or bend or break underneath. Picking up the story in Genesis 39, Joseph's brothers, if you missed last week, sold him to some traffickers, carried him to Egypt, a long way from home, and they went home and told his father he was dead. Look at Genesis chapter 39, beginning in verse 2. Let me show you something cool. It says this, pay attention to these words, "The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did," we're going to go on to see in the story that slave master gave him a whole lot of responsibility, let him carry a whole lot of weight. But if you've got your phone and you're scrolling through the scripture, scroll down to the end of the chapter. If you got your Bible open, look at the end of this chapter, verse 20, and look what it says. It says, "While Joseph was there in prison," change of scenery into the story, "the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care." Why? Because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. You notice that's almost identical language, beginning and the end of the stories. You can think of it as the two pieces of bread that hold a sandwich. Pieces of bread are important, but they're not the most important part of the sandwich. What's important is right there in the middle. Okay, or in keeping with our other illustration, what you could think of those two statements like the floor and the ceiling, the continuation of the dream, and what lies in the middle is really, really important because what lies in the middle between the floor and the ceiling, structural integrity. Load-bearing walls. Look at the story with me. Look back at verse 6. Joseph's a slave in the house of a wealthy landowner, and God allows everything Joseph touches to work. Verse 6. "So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he didn't concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, Joseph was well-built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, 'Come to bed with me.' But he refused. 'With me in charge,' he told her, 'my master doesn't concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he's trusted in my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master's withheld nothing from me except you because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?' And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, 'Come to bed with me.' But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he'd left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. 'Look,' she said to them, 'this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house.'" So if you're keeping score, this is the second time in Joseph's story that he's been betrayed by a cloak, right? But think about what you have here at the very beginning of the story. Joseph's in charge of Potiphar's whole house. And when you think of being in charge of the whole house, don't just think four walls of a structure, cleaning the floors, not to belittle that at all. But think of more Downton Abbey, in charge of the whole house and the whole household and the whole surrounding community. So better illustration here, Joseph's like the COO of a major family corporation with holdings in diversified areas, all kinds of different sectors. Okay, so think about this, at least so far in the story. God is protecting and promoting a promise that he's given to his people a long time ago. And as he protects his promise to his people and his plan to bless them as a family and ultimately all of the nations of the earth through them, notice who it is that God chooses to be a part of that. You notice where it is that God places him. It's not a preacher in a church. It's a young person with business gifts who's positioned in what we would call a secular organization. Just in case you know anyone like that in your life. And you notice what competency God holds up as the most important to the advancement of dreams in this moment when the story gets told. What's in the middle of the sandwich? Structural integrity. Okay, teenagers, college students, young professionals, pay attention to this. Joseph is a rising star in his industry. And look, the tests of prosperity and opportunity are passed by far fewer people than the tests of poverty. And our dreams, your dreams, even if they're not fully formed, cannot afford to flunk this test. So pay attention here. Thinking back through Joseph's story, think back at it through the lens of structural integrity. I think if you're looking at the story, you see three big vulnerabilities in Joseph's story in this moment. And I don't think they're the only three places that vulnerability gets tested, but I think they're the three that we see in this story, and I know they're three that we see in our stories all of the time. And you'll notice saying that they're vulnerabilities doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. It just means they're important. Think load-bearing walls. If you find yourself dealing with them or operating around them, for sure before you take a sledgehammer to them, you want to pay attention to these things. Joseph's story shows us three vulnerabilities and then how to reinforce them. We want to look at all of that today. So the first vulnerability that you see, if you're taking notes, write this. Vulnerability number one is power. And when you think power, think platform and pressure. Yeah, a couple of times in the story. Do you see it? Verse 4 and verse 6, the story goes out of its way to tell us how much power Joseph has in this organization. There's only one person on the org chart that's higher than him, and that person trusts him so much that he has virtually no oversight. He doesn't have people looking over his shoulder. He's got that guy, and that guy trusts him, which is part of the reason this situation is even able to find Joseph, isn't it? Okay, and think, the trappings of power, however much power it is, and whatever kind of power or platform it is, always come with a requisite pressure attached to it, doesn't it? And just think for a second about the leaders that you know who have failed in an area of structural integrity, from presidents to parents. The bigger the platform, the greater the power, the stronger the pressure. It's not bad, it's not wrong, it's not something to avoid, that kind of influence. But if you find yourself with influence of some kind, you have to pay attention to the load-bearing walls in your life. That's the first thing you see in the story. The second one is this. Highlights the vulnerability of payback. Payback. Power and payback. And I use payback because it's the word that starts with P for alliteration, so you can remember it. But it's really the idea of realizing, and when you see it in Joseph's story, that you're living as a victim on the wrong side of justice. You're living as a victim on the wrong side of justice. And it's easy to miss in Joseph's story. We'll talk about it in a second, but don't forget, Potiphar may have been a person that gave a whole lot of authority to Joseph, but Joseph still owned in this story. He's not getting a share of the profits at the end of the day. He doesn't have an equity share in the corporation if things go well, even though he's responsible for it. All this time, he's applying the wisdom of God and the favor of God and the pleasure of God and the gifts and the talents that God's given them. He's helping a rich guy's dreams get bigger, while Joseph, as far as we can tell, stays a long, long way away from his. It's hard to imagine Joseph not feeling at least a little bit of resentment in these moments, a little bit of bitterness in these moments. So the opportunity that's presented to Joseph would have been, think about it, a really, really simple way to stick it to the man, meaning Potiphar, in a way that nobody would ever find out about. But not just Potiphar. It's a pretty easy way to stick it to a God who sure doesn't seem to have done much for Joseph in the recent history of the story. When we find ourselves victims on the wrong side of justice, pay attention. That can be a vulnerability to pay close attention to. And be careful how you swing the sledgehammer. Last one is kind of the low-hanging fruit in the story. It's the obvious one, right? Pleasure is vulnerability number 3. Pleasure. We're talking about appetites here. And for Joseph, think, young, single, good-looking guy. It's not difficult to see why the vulnerability that would be pointed out here would be a sexual appetite. But this is true with any kind of appetite for pleasure in our life, at any stage of our life. From a sexual appetite to overeating, to some other kind of substance or stimulant, to an appetite for information, from gossip to the appetite for social media, to just keep clicking refresh or cable news because we're so afraid we're going to miss something or miss out on something. All of those can be vulnerabilities, places that we try to self-medicate our anxiety or our boredom, or in this story, what we've already talked about, our anger at injustice, or the pressure that we feel from power, or the power we're chasing in our dreams. And again, none of those vulnerabilities is wrong. Even the desire for payback or justice, not a wrong desire. It's a God-given desire for us to have. They're not wrong, they're vulnerabilities. When they show up in our stories, or they show up in our dreams, we have to pay attention to them. We have to pay attention to what we do with them. And here's the thing, when it comes to our structural integrity, we never really know how strong it is until it's tested. Until it's tested, our integrity, our structural integrity, it's just a theory. It's at best an educated guess that we have about how strong it is, which is why you want to pay attention to these areas in your life all along the way. And especially when you begin to feel pressure or weight or force, if you ever feel them cracking or bending or warping or fatiguing, or simply if you know that they could, it's a good time to add reinforcement to those load-bearing walls in your life. And Joseph's integrity in this story holds, doesn't it? Despite an extreme test and extraordinary prolonged pressure. Why does it hold? Well, because long before the pressure or the weight or the force of this moment, Joseph has reinforced each of the load-bearing walls in his life with something extraordinarily powerful. Look back at his response. He tells us what it was. Verse 8. This man with the power to have whatever he wants, whenever he wants it, a chance to get even more even with the injustice that he's experienced, and an invitation to fill his appetite in a way that nobody would know about. And yet, verse 8, he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. No one is greater in the house than I am. My master's withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Okay, the first thing that he tells us that you notice in this story, right? Reinforcement number 1, gravity. Gravity. When it comes to power or platform, Joseph realizes this opportunity may be private, but it is most certainly not just personal. It's what we've already talked about. Life is connected. A failure of one structural element in one area doesn't ever just affect one structural element in one area, even if it seems like it should, or seems like it could, or if it seems like it would. And the higher you climb, the bigger your platform, the stronger the pressure, the greater your power, the bigger the collateral damage. And Joseph names that. He says, how could I do this wicked thing and sin against God? One of my best friends is a pastor who had a mentor challenge him one time after a rash of a whole lot of moral failures of other pastors and in the news. A mentor challenged him to go sit down at a coffee shop and write out a list of all of the things that would happen in his life if he were to fail in that way. And he did. He sat down at the coffee shop and he started to write out the list of all the things that would happen. He came up with a list of more than 100 different things and relationships that would all affect one area of failure of his integrity. Everything from I'd have to tell my son to I'd probably lose my job, and everything in the middle of that. He realized it could cause a catastrophic failure to allow a breakdown in one hidden area of his life. And that just like buildings and bridges and aircraft, it wouldn't just affect him. The second reinforcement might surprise you. It did for me when I saw it. It's actually what makes the injustice in this story so hard to spot when we just read through it. Joseph's reinforced the load-bearing walls of his life and hopes and his dreams with gravity, but the second thing is gratitude. Gratitude. Do you see that in the story? You notice his response? Nothing. There's lots wrong in Joseph's story. He's a long way from his dream in this moment. But that's not what he emphasizes. Even in talking to Potiphar's wife, his focus is not on the one thing that's been withheld. It's on all the things he's been given. In fact, he says, nothing has been withheld from me except you. Which is not entirely even true, is it? I mean, his freedom's been withheld. That feels like a big thing. His family's been withheld. But that's not where Joseph's head is at. That's one of the reasons that his life holds up in this moment, is he's reinforced his life with gratitude, even in a terrible circumstance. If you think back even just through the story of God, back to the very beginning of the story of God, Genesis 1-3, you have the exact opposite story, don't you? I mean, God says to another couple, hey, it's all yours, except that one tree. Their perspective got focused on the one thing that had been withheld for them, the one thing that was forbidden, instead of the abundance that was theirs. And that's what the enemy leveraged to lead them to a catastrophic failure. Like, I've got that in me. You've got that in you. If we don't pay attention over time, that way of thinking will weaken our structural integrity. It'll warp our perspective. It'll wear us out. And it'll make us vulnerable. So be careful. Be wise. Be grateful. And the last one is this. It's guardrails. Guardrails. Reinforcement number 3 is guardrails. You see that in the story? She came to Joseph, it says, day after day after day, looking for the moment when he was weak, when fatigue would finally take over and his appetite would overwhelm him. You notice what he said in verse 10? It says, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. That word be with her, think about what you always picture when you picture the rich and the powerful in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. What are they always doing? They're lounging by the pool, being fanned by palm branches, eating grapes. That's the picture you get here with those words. She says, Joseph, come to bed with me. He says, nope. So the invitation gets followed up by, well, okay, then let's just hang out. Let's just talk. Let's just relax together for a while. And Joseph says, no, not even that. Now, be careful with this. Don't take it too far. The idea is not that a man and a woman can never hang out, never talk, never relax under any circumstances. In this story, she'd already made it plain what her agenda was with Joseph. And he knew that her agenda plus his appetite was not going to end well. So he decided to put up guardrails to make sure he couldn't just fall in this area. If he was going to go into this area, he was going to have to take a long, running, flying jump there because he'd put guardrails in place along the way. And you need those too in the area of your appetites. So look, if sexual sin's not your primary appetite or the way that your pleasure is going to be tested, I want you to think about what would be and be realistic with yourself. What do the guardrails need to look like for you? If the appetite for you is substance and you just know I can't say no after the second drink, maybe you don't need to order the first one. If it's gluttony that you know is your issue, then perhaps CC's Pizza is not the place to schedule lunch appointments. And if pornography is your thing, look, install every piece of software you can find. Enlist every single accountability partner you can name. Ditch the smartphone and the laptop and set up a desktop in your living room where everyone can see it. Because look, I know it's awkward. I know it's inconvenient. I know it's annoying. So is a catastrophic failure of your dreams. What decision will you wish you'd made when you look at these moments in the future? Look, nothing is too big when it comes to protecting your dreams. We'll talk about it next week, no matter how the situation turns out. And it's not going to turn out great immediately for Joseph. In fact, Joseph does everything right, and he's going to experience the consequence he would have experienced as if he'd done everything wrong. But we know the end of his story. This is how Joseph's going to get an introduction to Pharaoh in the end. The chance to serve him and ultimately to rise up and save him and Joseph's whole family and the whole nation and ultimately the nations at the end of the earth. We know how his story ends from here. Look, we don't know how your story ends from here, which means you have no idea what hangs in the balance, the decisions you make today, and especially the decisions you make in areas no one else will see. Choose to live with gravity. Choose to live with gratitude. And choose to set up guardrails for your dreams. Because the greatest threat to a dream that you can't see yet may be those decisions that no one else will see now. And in fact, because Joseph lived this way, we have hope for the question that some of us are asking from here. What if I've already failed? What if this message is too late? What if I slept with the girl and I stole the money? Or I'm a slave to the substance? There may be consequences to the collapse, and you may be living in them today. But grace is available to you. And in part through Joseph's story. The promise that God gave Joseph's great-grandfather and stayed faithful to through Joseph's story, his grandpa's story and his dad's story, who both of them lived through catastrophic failures of their integrity. Joseph, whose integrity held up, it's a promise that continues to you today. Grace is available to you. God's in the business of restoring and rebuilding broken people with broken dreams. There's hope for you and for your dreams from here, and it comes through the person of Jesus, who died to pay for your collapse and lives to give you life to live and the power to live from this moment on and to live towards the future without using the same materials you built with up till now. Would you bow your head with me? There's a chance that that last part was the part for you today. What you need to hear from this moment is that Jesus came to seek you, knowing you. He knows the story. He was there for the moment. He came to seek you and to save you, not to condemn you, and to let you know that he's given his life for you, to rescue you and to restore you, and to give you a purpose and a hope from today. And he offers it to you as a gift, a chance to start fresh, start new, and to go with you wherever you go. And you can receive it as a gift right where you sit in this moment. Lord, for the person that came to this moment, and that's them, and they know that's them, and they're living in the catastrophic failure of their life, and they desperately need hope today, Lord, I pray that you would give that to them, that you would reassure them in a way that only you can, that it's true, that there's hope for them from here, and that in this moment, they would put their trust in a Jesus who died for them, who rose from the dead, and who offers them full forgiveness of their past and their present and their future, and his power and presence with them wherever they go. Lord, for some of us who began that relationship a long time but have wandered away from it, perhaps have been building a different way and we're living in the collapse as well, Lord, would you remind us? Would you allow us to come back to that truth and to that story? Would you allow our next steps from this moment to build with different materials than the ones that brought us to this point? Would you let us live lives of integrity, because we believe you put us here for a purpose, and we believe it matters, and we want to live towards it and to not squander it on an appetite or in the pressure or in the moment that feels too strong for us to resist. Would you let us build guardrails in our life that protect the dreams that we have and that you had when you made us? We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.